Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Also Footy. It's your boy Ray, and tonight I've got Mac with me. Welcome, Mac.
Good evening.
And Gio.
What is good, guys?
On today's podcast, we're going to be doing a career retrospective on one of the greats, and that is, of course, Toni Kroos, recently retired Toni Kroos. Before we get into it, don't forget to follow us on our social media, both on X and Instagram. Our handle is at house_of_footy. Also, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to us. We are on both Spotify and YouTube. And lastly, feel free to get in touch with us via email. We love hearing from you guys and we want you guys getting involved. Our email is houseoffooty@hotmail.com. All right, so for today's podcast, I'm going to let Mac lead us for the retrospective look back on Toni Kroos' career. So, Mac, go ahead.
See, I want to start off this. I don't know why I'm doing this. Both of you are the Real Madrid fans. This seems a little abusive, if this makes sense. Again, I hope you both enjoy this podcast. I won't, but we're here for it. With that being said, though, I guess let's start off with kind of being an open-ended conversation about Toni Kroos. I guess his career, his impact on soccer, kind of big picture. When I say Toni Kroos, his footballing career, what is maybe a favorite moment that comes to mind? Maybe a favorite interaction with a teammate, or a goal, assist? What screams out to you when I first mentioned, I guess, Toni Kroos and his career, if that's, of course, international or club-wise? Let's start with you, Gio. What jumps out to you?
I see him as just a very, a noble guy. If you want to put it in that term. Just because he's seen the highs of say German football. He's especially on the international stage, and then he's also experienced the lows of international football. Obviously, being German, very passionate about representing your country. I think it was last World Cup was it last World Cup? Last World Cup when Germany were really struggling, even struggling to get out of the
2018 World Cup.
That's right.
2018 World Cup when they were really struggling. Germany, obviously, a lot of the older guys weren't really, pulling their weight anymore. Obviously, you could see it was an inevitable changing of guards. But, how long was that process going to be? But one thing that stood out for me was obviously one of the goals of the tournament, arguably, was his free kick to win against, I believe it was Sweden.
Yep.
The touch to obviously Marco Reus, and he stopped it, and the perfect take to give Germany that win, to keep their hopes alive. That's just the passion of football that we know, and we see Toni Kroos in his eyes, and that he's just a lover of the game, and just so passionate, even though knowing Germany's chances were slim to none in that tournament. So yeah, I just see him as a very noble guy for his club and country.
What about you, Ray? Same question. Is there maybe Gio brought up an individual goal? When I mentioned Toni Kroos and his impact on football, or even you as a Real Madrid fan, what comes first to mind to you?
8 to 9 out of 10 in most instances. And Toni Kroos is a player that won't necessarily grab the headlines for his amazing output in terms of goals and assists per season. But any given season, and any given game, he'll give you an average of 8 or 9 out of 10 based off of just how tidy he is as a footballer, his output for the team to keep things going, and just kind of like what Gio was saying. Noble is a word that Gio used, but I would say reliable is another word that I would use to describe him, and it really encapsulates the fact that he, and we'll probably talk about this, the fact that he won a couple of Champions Leagues, 2020, retired from international football to focus on his club football, went on to win more with Real Madrid, and then even came back to the national team because, of course, they missed him so much. So that's pretty much what encapsulates him as a player to me. A reliable, gives you a great performance all around every time you have him on the pitch, and that's pretty much all I can think about when I think of this version of Toni Kroos.
Absolutely. Again, I think you both were spot on in terms of individual moments. Again, what he meant to as a football player. I'm just going to go read through some stats. If you're looking at the overarching fact of his career, and just going to run through some numbers. Please feel free to jump in if you have any, initial queries or any highlights that you want to bring up as I'm going through these. In terms of senior games, he played 674 games with 58 goals and 128 assists for 17 seasons across 3 different clubs. In fact, though, he was actually owned or represented really 2 clubs because his time at Bayer Leverkusen was unknown, in fact, from Bayern Munich at that time because he came through Bayern Munich's youth system. Played 114 senior caps with Germany and scored 17 goals. Was a 2014 World Cup winner, earlier mentioned, and was actually only, which was shocking to me going through this, he was only a one-time Germany Football Player of the Year in 2018. Thinking how long an impact he had, and I think goes to show what you were mentioning earlier, right, is where he is a little bit more underrated, where I think the best part of him is that he sets the table for everybody else, right? And something that we'll touch on later. But I think the last part is he's a serial winner. 6-time Champions League winner, one with Bayern Munich, which I think a lot of people tend to forget about, and of course 5 with Real Madrid. He won the German League 3 times, Spanish League 4 times, and 9 cup medals between both the Spanish and German leagues. Again, not really much to write home about those competitions, but whatever it is. And he is a 3-time UEFA team of the year. Actually, 3 times I think it was the 2015, then 16, then 17 years. So that was really how a lot of people viewed it, where he was one of the best midfielders in the world in that time period, and was consistently up there. And just talking about that individually and what really comes out to me as a table set player, if we're to jump over to some fun stats that maybe we can kind of pick out through his career, the one that kind of illustrates to me the most about what he's able to individually do on a pitch, where if you're looking for a player, not necessarily a Sergio Busquets, sitting right in front of a back 4, but that complementary player beside him, I think this really illustrates that. And 3 times, he led all big 5 European leagues, so that's the Premier League, Ligue 1, Serie A, Bundesliga, and La Liga, into passes into the final third. So with that being said, 3 times through a full calendar year, he was the best player from getting your team into attacking third to let your real kind of your money makers, your showstoppers, create goals and opportunities. And the more times you're doing that, the more opportunities you're going to have to score. So he really was kind of the table setter for everybody else. And 3 times through his career, he was best in the world at that. And I think that is something that not many people think about, is where, how do we get to the ball into the final third to kind of get our Cristiano Ronaldo's, our Gareth Bale's, our Benzema's opportunities? They kind of just look at that end result, versus if you don't have that first step, you never get there. And he was very much able to kind of placate, I would argue, a lot of, not to kind of throw shade on them because they were great in their own result and kind of in their own areas of the pitch, but players let's say Pepe, or at certain points in his career, or whoever's playing center half for Real Madrid, wasn't necessarily the greatest on the ball. You don't have to worry. You just give it to Toni Kroos, and he'll get us into the final third. It's fine. So very much for me, I think that really screams out to him individually as a player, as well as he was the first German to win the Champions League with 2 different clubs. And I think he was part of kind of, not necessarily maybe in our lifetime, our generation was the first ones to really kind of cross that bridge of going outside of the Bundesliga to kind of be a main star type of player. There wasn't too many before him. I think Mesut Ozil had just recently joined Real Madrid, and he was kind of part of that era. So I think for me, that's another part where not many people look at him, because generally prior to then, the best Italian players, they played in Serie A. The best German players, they played in the Bundesliga. And still, even probably a little bit too much to this day, the best English players played in the Premier League and so forth. Everyone really stuck to their own. So I would say he was one of the kind of, I guess, the first to open that gateway for our generation, seeing that, that's a great move to do. But as I'm reading through that, I guess, Ray, to go to you, is there any of those aspects that stand out to you, or stats that maybe you've noticed that, this kind of is very emblematic of Toni Kroos and the player that he was?
No, well, I really like the fact that you mentioned he is one of the only Germans, or actually the first German, to win the Champions League with 2 clubs, because, like you said, it's synonymous that he is linked with Real Madrid. And, of course, a lot of fans won't, newer fans won't really remember that he actually came up through the Bayern system, and we can touch on that a little bit afterwards. Mac, with sort of what happened with him being kind of shown the door at Bayern, and he eventually left to a same type of club in terms of the expectation that comes along with it, and really just stepped into it. Has been there for it looks like actually a decade, 2014, right? So and came out of that on the better side of the history, of course, with 6 Champions League titles. So that in itself just shows how consistent he has been. And talking about consistency, I don't have the stat with me right now, but I think in the game, one of the games in this previous Euro 2024 tournament, he had, I think, over 100 passes in a single game, misplaced 1 out of all that. And it just shows, I was kind of rewatching some of his interviews and videos that leading up to our podcast today, and it really shows what he highlights in terms of he was never really a quick player, but his speed of thought and his technique was what put him over the top. And that really shows with that passing stat that unfortunately I don't have right now, but was grabbing all headlines during the Euros with his passing ability and pass completion. So that's one stat that really stood out to me. I guess I'll toss it to you, Gio.
I think just talking about Toni Kroos and his stats, again, like it was touched on a lot through Euros, is he's a upper echelon passer in the game of football, in the entirety of football, not just not just within Real Madrid or being a German player. I think oftentimes because he played for Real Madrid, oftentimes compared to the greats of their rivals, Andres Iniesta, Sergio Busquets, guys of that nature, Xavi, how great were they in the midfield? And because he's not flashy per se, not your stereotypical guy who will, score you a banger. He'll score you a banger occasionally, but, don't expect him to go out there and score because he's going to try and set you up. He's going to try and, win the ball back, as quickly as possible. But, to win 6 Champions Leagues, and then to be a part of the back-to-back, I think. Back-to-back. Is that right? 3 in a row?
3 in a row. Yeah.
To be a part of that, I think just really says it all. And not just to be a part of it and to say I'm on the bench. That's more of a Nacho. That's more of a Danny Carvajal type vibe. Not that realm. He is integral, in all of those Champions League wins, inclusive of the most recent one as well. So I think, because he isn't the flashiest guy, which really, should have been a very easy thing to notice because he has worn the same boots, the same style of boots for the entirety of his career. I think the only time he had a different pair of boots was maybe when he played for Bayer Leverkusen, when he wore the Predators. But he switched into the Addy pairs and has never changed from then. And he's just a no bullshit type player. He likes what he likes, very traditional. He's the type of guy who doesn't even cut his socks like a lot of modern football players do. He wears the team socks as they are and goes out there and performs, like Ray said, to an 8 or 9 out of 10 on a consistent basis. And you just can't hate on that.
So I'll definitely try to. I promise you. We'll save that for a little bit later in the podcast. So I'll do my best to do so. But I do agree with what you're saying, Gio, in terms of where I know there was this conversation in the NBA, and I'm going to switch sports a couple times here. In the NBA, where there's like, there's the bus driver and there's the passenger, right? Whose title is it? That type of thing, right? For me, if we were to kind of carry on the analogy, if we're talking about, let's say, you're in a travel vehicle going on a road trip, okay, he's not the driver, but he's like the front seat driver, like passenger. He's not sitting in the back of the car. He's helping you get there. He's making sure everything is okay. Big ups to those guys. They definitely appreciate their effort there. But to switch over to a different sport, again, I think this is the theory why I know it's a little bit out there. But I love the idea if soccer or football would introduce the idea of like the hockey assist, where the pass to the pass. I think that would kind of, if we were to kind of flash out those types of numbers for Toni Kroos, I think that's more so where he would stand out, because it's about getting to the final third to get that cross for that tap into that goal. I think that's what he would have done. And if we were to introduce that going forward, I think he's a player, if we look at that type of archetype, but that type of, stat, which give a little bit more light and spread a little bit more sunshine onto what he does as a footballer. I guess to wrap up before we go on a break, just kind of, I don't know necessarily, and I don't know if this is going to go with your answers, where, if you kind of were to build the dream scenario for Toni Kroos as a footballer, if maybe an ideal position, team, system, manager, whatever it looks like. I don't, both of you might say a cop out, like the back-to-back-to-back treble winning team, ha ha ha, Andrew, he's already been in that, ain't no better thing than that, fuck off. I understand. That can be your answer. But if there's something else differently, maybe on an international stage, or if you want to plop him into a different country as an example, what do you think that maybe theoretically would be what would be the best situation for him to get that sunlight, to be able to get that kind of spotlight and recognition and fit him best as a footballer? Gio, what about you? What is your first thought on that?
Obviously, the easy answer would be obviously put him in a Pep system, and he would flourish as I think a lot of strong midfielders do. But I think that would be a cop out. In the perfect scenario, and if it was the perfect time, I think if he was almost there to take the reins from an Andrea Pirlo at Juventus, I think, and was playing under his wing, I think he could have flourished under Italian football as well, because again, it's so fine-tuned as it was back then, super fine-tuned, and the way he's able to pass the ball and have the vision to seek out that long ball or their forwards, like he does a lot with Vinny. I think he could have flourished there very well. And in the perfect world, if it was him partnered with that Juventus Pogba, I think that tandem would have been very good to see, very fun to see. And Max holding his face as if I'm referring to the Pogba of Man United, but no. This is the Pogba of Juventus. This is
it's just, I want you to remember this for later, okay? But continue.
This is a different type of Pogba, okay, that Man United never really got to fully see, past or present, or pre or post departure. But yeah, I think that would have been pretty fun to see.
What about you, Rick?
For me, it's simple. I do have a couple of scenarios, but one that I don't want to give away for what I'm going to say in the later part of the podcast is, if he was, hear me out, Mac, if he was English, and instead of having are we going to put Declan Rice with Jude Bellingham and or Phil Foden? No, forget all that. Declan Rice at the 6, you got Toni Kroos right next to him, and whoever you want in front of them to do no defensive work, because Toni Kroos is not necessarily the greatest defensive midfielder, but he can get around the pitch, do his work enough when needed. But of course, when not needed, he can dictate the pace of the game. In international football, it's a little slower, like kind of what Gio was saying about him potentially playing at Juve and dictating play in Serie A. So I think that would really fit him. So that's my short answer for that part. What about you, Mac?
Again, for me, I think the correct answer is he was already in the perfect situation for him in a lot of ways. I think and I know this kind of come back to a trend with me. I understand maybe why he fit in some cases, but the Luka Modric partnership for him was ideal because it was able to kind of allow him to flourish in the areas that he was better at, and allowed Luka Modric to get further out of the pitch where Modric himself, when he was at Tottenham, wasn't really allowed to do necessarily. I think, though, the problem, and the conversation always goes up, and I know you both may have your opinions on this, and definitely a lot of football fans too, where it's like the Xavi, Iniesta, Busquets versus the Toni Kroos, Luka Modric, or Casemiro. I think the conversation ends with Casemiro. For me, I think if you had a better version of a Casemiro in that spot, I think that they are knocking on the door of that conversation as that comparison. So for me, I think that's really the missing link. I really like the idea of him under even a Jose Mourinho and that type of football, or what Ancelotti has done, because he's very malleable in terms of being allowed to fit into a defensive system or a ball possession system. He's kind of like an ideal football player in a lot of ways. And for me, he's like the evolutionary line of what Xabi Alonso was, where a better version of that type of player. So for me, again, I think he's so malleable. It's so easy for him to fit in different things. Where the better his teammates are around him, the better he can be as well, because he's such a connective tissue between the full entire team. So if he had a better version of that, that for me is kind of the ideal system. I do love, of course, the English out. That's always tickles my fancy, makes me a little bit happy. But for me, again, he was in it. If you had some slight adjustments there, I think you're talking about maybe the best midfield of all time. Unfortunately, you just have that weaker link there, in my opinion. Is there any other, before we go to break, is there any other, I guess, systems, ideal situations that either of you want to call out before we go? And come back with some funny moments throughout their career, maybe?
Not for me. I kind of don't want him to. I didn't imagine him to want to play in the Premier League very much. Um, yeah, I think a little too rough maybe for his liking. But yeah, no. It was either Spain, stay in Germany, go to Spain, and Italy was a far maybe third.
Yeah, I do agree with that.
Okay, so with that being said, let's take a quick break, and we're going to come back with, like I said, maybe some funny moments, which is really weird to hear comedy coming out of Germany, but we'll see if there's any there in his career. So stay with us. We'll be right back after the break.
Welcome back to Also Footy, guys. We are going to continue now our further discussion on Toni Kroos's career. So, Mac, take it away.
So again, normally in this category, we talk about like funny moments when we maybe talk about like Zlatan Ibrahimovic or other players of the ilk where, you know what, there is a little bit of comedy to them. Toni Kroos, it was a little bit tough. Aside from being the poster boy of the Aryan race, it was tough for me to necessarily pick out, okay, what are some funny moments here? So after doing some research, I was able to pull up maybe someone finds this humorous, maybe not, right? But during the Champions League final of 2022, because of security issues, it was pushed back. And Carlo Ancelotti said the game was postponed. It starts at now 9:30. Toni Kroos was like, we'll win it later. It doesn't matter. I don't know if that's a little disrespectful. Maybe other people find that funny. It is what it is. For me, though, my favorite moment looking back, and maybe for Brazilians, they don't find it funny, but I do. He actually scored 2 goals in the 7-1 thrashing in Brazil on Germany's route to end up winning the World Cup later in the tournament. I think this was in the semifinals, if I remember correctly. And just watching back those highlights of seeing them play, I don't know how Twitter would react today if a game like that happened. But for me, it's hilarious because one of the second goal he scores, particularly where Khedira cuts it back to Toni Kroos, which is like I would do that in FIFA for the tap in, and then Ozil does it later for Khedira as kind of the give back in some ways. But just their absolute annihilation and how Toni Kroos is a central part of that, and he scored 2 of those goals, which no one will ever remember other than the fact that, because like if you score 2 goals in the semifinal of the World Cup, you're a hero. No, that's just, he's one of the couple of guys to score 2 goals in that game, in fact. So for me, that was hilarious looking back and going through back and realizing, yeah, he was not the biggest name on the team sheet, but he was part of that team, played very well, went on to win the World Cup. But that thrashing is just hilarious. I guess for either of you, is there any, I guess maybe something behind the curtain that I'm not aware of about his time with Real Madrid or something like that, you know what, he gave you a chuckle or two across his career?
Yeah, I'll go first. It was, I forgot what they were celebrating, but David Alaba was talking to the crowd on the championship bus on the mic, and he actually hands the mic, or points the attention to Toni Kroos, expecting him to say something after Alaba had said a couple of words in Spanish. Toni Kroos, camera pans to Toni Kroos. He panics because for as long as he's been in Spain, doesn't know that much Spanish, and he doesn't know what to say. Toni Kroos proceeds to just start singing, just sings Madrid constantly back and forth, and all you see is Thibaut Courtois, Marcelo, Danny Carvajal just dying because they know this guy doesn't know what to say because he doesn't really speak Spanish like that, and he's just filling in the void. And that don't really see that side of Toni Kroos much, apart from the interviews he does with obviously one of his closest friends on the German team being Thomas Muller, and one of his closest friends on Real Madrid, Luka Modric. So if you're a Toni Kroos fan, Real Madrid fan, if you watch any of those videos, you do get to see that more, the playful side of Toni Kroos.
Yeah. For me, I don't necessarily have a funny moment that is that comes from him, but again, I'm gonna have to reference the Euro 2020 disappointment that Germany had. Went out in the round of 16. Really poor tournament as a whole for Germany, and honorary Bayern Munich president Uli Hoeneß came out, said that Toni Kroos' style of play emphasizes horizontal passing and doesn't really fit the modern game. And former German international Lothar Matthäus expressed similar statements, saying he doesn't agree with Toni Kroos' style of play and he's no longer international class, which really just comes back to bite them, because of course he goes on to win more Champions Leagues and even returns to the German national team 4 years later. So that in itself just really encapsulates a moment where he's being doubted, but he just lets his class show through. And my type of comedy is really karma coming back to bite people who are saying poor things about another. So proven right by Toni Kroos there.
Lovely to see that. That going on to the next kind of category that we want to be able to cover, and sliding doors, where if something happened at this stage in his life, how could the rest of kind of his potential life could have played out, his career could have played out. I do want to touch on the individual transfer to Real Madrid shortly. I promise you. But I do want to kind of bring in probably the only what if scenario that I could find looking throughout his career is where in 2013-14, he actually agreed to sign for a Manchester United. The quote being is, I knew before that Manchester wanted me, and Moyes underlined that absolutely. It was a really nice afternoon with very nice people. We talked a lot about United's footballing plan, which convinced me. In the end, we agreed to do it. We agreed verbally. At that time period, so this was David Moyes' first year at Manchester United. He would go on to get fired in April. I think it was because I think his contract was about to expire. In that time period, he was looking at a different club, and David Moyes had convinced him to go to Manchester United. This would have been the season before Pogba would be signed to Manchester United under Louis van Gaal. And for me, Gio, you spoiled your boy a little bit there. I think that would have been perfect. What we may not have had this downturn of a Manchester United that we've had since post Alex Ferguson. If you're talking about Toni Kroos doing a facsimilation of what Andreas Pirlo did at Juventus, playing alongside Paul Pogba in that midfield, where right now, since then, Manchester United still have never been able to solve that problem, as well as they would go on the season after to sign Andres Herrera, which for me, he's the dirty work guy alongside Pirlo and Paul Pogba, what Mercutio was doing at Juventus. So for me, I would have absolutely loved to see that, the synergy between those two type of players, how that could have impacted Manchester United. Maybe they aren't where they are right now, and you're talking about Pogba maybe not going on to Voodoo, maybe talking about winning some Champions Leagues, you know? So I'm here nor there. However, again, we'll talk about it later. Maybe Toni Kroos did make the right choice. But for me, I think that's the only moment when we look back, what could have been different, right? Maybe he could have stayed at Bayern Munich. I wasn't necessarily as interested in that because they would have just signed the next German player or whatever, who cares? But for me, that was the biggest what if moment or sliding doors moment. Is there any, I guess, first, I know, Ray, I think you might have the same one or a different one. But Gio, I know you mentioned earlier you maybe not wanted to see him in the Premier League, but you did reference how he could have done a Pirlo role. What do you think about that? Would you have wanted to see that, or you think, you know what, maybe I'm a little bit overreaching in that situation?
Listen, obviously, given the opportunity to sign a player like that, you obviously want to. But it's not the first time Man United has teased a German midfielder. Obviously, the infamous Mesut Ozil wanted. Initially, from what we're heard, is that he wanted Man United first, but obviously couldn't get that done. And second option was Arsenal, and he landed in Arsenal. Played great there. Definitely had some great years there. But it wasn't the first time Man U got blue balled by a German. So, I, if it would have happened, I would have loved to see it again. Like you said, that Cruz ex Pogba. Who knows how well or how poorly that could have done. But no, I think based on the two scenarios that I've kind of created, but obviously in another universe, what if he signed and took over, you know, a Busquets or not necessarily a Busquets, but an Iniesta. We've seen players jump to rival teams, but if he had gone to, sort of the Catalan and played with alongside like a Xavi or a Busquets, how could that have solved their midfield problems? Because obviously Barcelona thrives in the midfield. Now that we're seeing their younger guys kind of come through the system, and seeing them kind of not regain old form, but play a lot better. How could that have changed? But that's an alternate universe idea, but would definitely have been very crazy after playing for Real Madrid.
Yeah, and I feel like it would be doing exactly what Gundogan's doing now, kind of mentoring the Pedris and Gavis coming up in that Barca squad, and maybe saving some of them legs as well, sharing those minutes so they don't get injured and ultimately not play as much as they are now. But one other sliding door moment, if I may jump in here, Mac, is picture this. 2 seasons ago, Real Madrid unfortunately got knocked out of the Champions League. I think it was Man City that won their first Champions League title. There were talks about Toni Kroos potentially retiring or what's he going to do. And of course, in June of 2023, he does sign the contract extension with Real Madrid. But what if he doesn't sign that contract extension and he goes back to a team that I'm actually wearing right now, Bayern Munich, for that season, the season that just gone by? Could he be could he have been the pivotal player to help Harry Kane win something in his first season at Bayern Munich? Because he had a fantastic season this past season, and they were quite close to getting past PSG. I think, was it PSG in the Champions League?
Yeah.
It could have been their chance for him to come back to Germany, cement his legacy in his home nation, and then of course go on to play in the Euros with Germany. But unfortunately, it didn't happen for Bayern, and fortunately for Toni Kroos, of course, he goes on to win his sixth Champions League with Real Madrid, and of course La Liga as well. So that's really my sliding door moment for what could have been regarding Toni Kroos's career. But I guess we want to move on from there, Mac.
Yeah. So yeah, just to clarify, it was against Real Madrid. It was the back-to-backs. Real Madrid's the one that. So Toni Kroos in this situation would face his team that he would have ended up playing, which I think would have been interesting. However, but I think we both learned from these respective clubs of Manchester United and Bayern Munich. If you have the chance to sign Fellaini instead of Toni Kroos or Eric Dyer instead of Toni Kroos, you can't miss out on the opportunity, right? It is what it is there. But now, apologies for that take. It is what it is. But now what's aged the best throughout his career. For me, again, I think there's two moments that stand out. One, Gio, you kind of displayed to us earlier in the podcast with the free kick against Sweden, where in his international career, was there ever a standout moment when, he kind of took the reins for his team where he was able to get across the finish line? No, because they ended up still not making it out of the group stage. But that moment felt like, that's a big moment for Germany. They still, again, they didn't get out of the group stage, but, good for him. That free kick was phenomenal. As well as scoring, I don't know if it was that same season or later on, he scored from a corner kick, which felt like this was kind of the first steps to that, where it's like, hey, I did this here because it was almost parallel to a goal in some ways, like a corner kick, but if I just take a couple steps back out to the left, I can do this from here, great credit to him there. But I think the other one is actually the decision to go for Real Madrid itself and kind of bet on himself. And this is where I want to talk more so about the transfer from Bayern Munich to Real Madrid. So what was happening in that time period, if we take ourselves back a decade, I know it was a long time ago, but in 2014, the agreed-upon fee for Real Madrid, to Real Madrid was only 25 million euros, which nowadays, that's a quarter of an Antony. Think about that. But what ended up coming out is Toni Kroos' agent, Volker Struth, kind of did a kind of tell all back then about, okay, what was the transfer? The reason why is that Bayern Munich at that time was signing Mario Götze, who I think just ended up scoring the World Cup winning goal while he was playing for Dortmund, I think, at the time. And he was getting an annual salary of 10 million euros a year. Whereas Bayern Munich were only offering Toni Kroos 6. So his agent said, hey, let's go ahead and make, like, you're offering this guy this. We feel our guy's almost as worthy. Let's kind of offer 10. They kind of, gave an offer of, oh, okay, instead of 6, let's give you 6.5. Obviously, Toni Kroos and his agent felt that was a little disrespectful, hence the reason why he went out and explored other options. And at that time, Pep Guardiola was in the process of taking over Bayern Munich. He's like, no, we need to keep Toni Kroos here. I want him to be like a main focal point of what I'll build the team around. The ownership of Bayern Munich said, no, we're going to let him go. This is too much money. So I think Toni Kroos betting on himself, saying, no, I'm worth X. I can go get Y in the market from this other team, which is what he did for Real Madrid. And since then, went on to win another 5 Champions League. And I think to this day, Bayern Munich still haven't won one, because the Arjen Robben one was his first one. So again, huge credit to him making that decision, betting himself, making that change of scenery, which a lot of players at that time weren't necessarily being as forthcoming to do about it as they are nowadays. So for me, I think that's what's aged the best. That decision, that betting on himself, and that picking Madrid. Because at that moment, 2014 Madrid, not to make a direct comparison, feels a lot like, let's say, this year's Manchester United, right? They were in the era of dominance of Barcelona and kind of in the shadow of the other team. So to put himself out there and to go to Real Madrid, I think wasn't an easy decision, but we can all agree, and I think everyone would agree, was the right decision.
Even, beyond the international things, in terms of betting on himself, even going to Madrid, and then obviously having that little lull period where, say, he wasn't that Toni Kroos that we're used to seeing, and then obviously the Tchouaméni signing, and then the Camavinga signing, is this the change of guards? I think that's why also him and Luka Modric also have that kind of close relationship, is that, is this the end for us at Real Madrid? But again, like, their friendship, they kind of stuck together. They kind of bet on themselves and bounce back. In reality, Camavinga and Tchouaméni aren't the ones yet. Maybe in the future, we are still those guys, and we're still going to provide what Carlo Ancelotti needs in order to win La Liga, in order to win another Champions League. And they proved that. And they proved that this year. Obviously, with Girona being so competitive this year, Barcelona being competitive maybe up until maybe the latter half of the season, and then the Champions League really was the cherry on top of the cake. To cap it at 6 Champions League each. But no, it was the perfect send off. Obviously, granted, going into the first game of the Euros, I think that's all we could talk about was him and Ilkay Gundogan was absolutely killing it. So they definitely bet on themselves, and look, now it's like apart from winning the Euros being the perfect send off, I think to cap it off like this year, I don't think he would have wanted it any other way.
Yeah, and for me, I guess really what's aged the best, you guys already mentioned a lot of positive things that happened in his career. For me, something that Gio has already mentioned, his Adidas contract with the Adipros, because there's, of course, images of him wearing the Adipros from very early on, taking them off after the game and cleaning them, his own pair. And Adidas were like, well, we can market it, and he's such a good player that we're just going to keep providing him with pairs. And so that's really, for me, as a football boot type of guy, and I know Gio relates to this, something that aged very, very well. And of course, I think Adidas can now recreate that shoe and market it with Toni Kroos. So that's really what's aged the best for me.
So now, my favorite part of the podcast is what aged the worst for Toni Kroos. No, I'm sorry, that was unnecessary. But no, for me, I think it's really hard to pinpoint an individual moment, because I think if you ask any of his teammates, there's no poor decision. He wasn't a bad teammate. He wasn't a bad kind of guy in the locker room type of player. But for me, I think that if you look at his international career, I think aside from the 2014 World Cup, which I know is kind of putting a lot to the side because winning World Cup is huge, but for me, he never, though when I mention those moments, take the reins for an international team. Aside from winning the World Cup in 2014, Germany since then really kind of never reached their heights up until coming for Euros in Germany itself. Still kind of only making it to the quarters. It really was a tough arc to his career where he should have been in his prime from age 26, 34. I think the furthest they made it was they lost to France in the Euros semifinals in 2016, which then France ended up going on to lose against Portugal. And if they just got over that France up, they would have been the favorites in the final if they did go on to make that. And they did make out the group stage in 2018, which we had earlier talked about. Lost to England. England got a shite in the round of 16 in 2020. And then he retired because he wanted to be out of it. Got back in, immediately lost in the quarters. So for me, in his prime, where he's one of the guys that, and I use carrying on the analogy from being kind of the driver to the passenger seat to the back seat, it really felt like in the 2014 he was more of the back seat, which again, no shame to that. Still won a World Cup. Like again, Lautaro Martinez can flash his World Cup medal around as much as he wants, but did he play Did he play a minute in the final? Like 2, but still he played. You know, like there's a dip. I understand there's levels to this, but for me, I think in the prime of his career, we never saw him win at the high level. Is that, and as we talked about, did he still do his job as a table setter? Did he still do his job as getting his team up the pitch? Yes, but
Right.
I don't necessarily say that's. I'm not trying to say that's so much of a detractor to him because it's a lot about the upfront players around him. But it's just unfortunate that final kind of piece of the puzzle, to use another analogy, that kind of missing piece of Exodia that he was missing to kind of create the perfect career, felt like he was missing. And if it was kind of this last Euros, that could have been it, or at least one more international competition where he was one of the guys. I think that for me is the only part of our careers I can look at with any sort of, I don't even want to say blemish, that's a little bit disrespectful, but I think any sort of regret. From either of you to jump in, Ray, I guess for you,
I think
is there any negative for you aside from that?
you've kind of nailed on what I was going to speak about with his international career, but even just maybe recency bias, the way Germany went out to the eventual winners of the Euros, of course, this year, to Spain. Host nation, retirement tournament, very much like Zinedine Zidane in the 2006 World Cup. Could have been his moment. First of all, they don't start the game well. Toni Kroos should have been at least received a yellow card, if not sent off in that game. They go down, and they come back, tie it up, make it go to extra time. Everything's in their favor now, and this could be the fairy tale ending to sort of get past Spain, and then of course go on and go further into the tournament, giving himself a chance to win. Ultimately, though, it wasn't meant to be for him, and it just went out in a very anticlimactic way for him to end his career, full stop, because of course he's no longer be playing for club football, and of course his international career has not ended. So that's really what's aged the worst for me. Anything for you, Gio?
Not really. I think you guys touched on most of it. Obviously, getting kind of, doubted in terms of his international contributions, and then coming back and, proving himself in different stages of football. But apart from that, I think Toni Kroos is really just a class guy. Like you said, cleans his own boots, still wears the same boots, isn't much of a complainer, I don't think. It's just really about going out there and doing his best and winning for whatever team he plays for. So, in my eyes, class act. No real, poorly aged things I'd say that stand out to me.
Fair enough. So let's wrap up the podcast with just kind of our final thoughts. Appreciate that. It's like, so we're taking a look back and take a step back. Do you feel like he's an overrated or underrated type of player when you're looking back at Toni Kroos, his career as a whole, and your final thoughts about him as a player now that he, as Ray mentioned, that he's retired from football? Let's start with you, Ray. What would be your final thoughts on that?
So I think first and foremost, he is, based on what he's won and sort of now that he's getting his flowers, fairly rated. There's a lot of people looking back that are going to look back and say he's, of course, one of the best to do it for Madrid. And I think that's fair to say. Though I do have to say the teams that he was playing for and sort of the manner that they wanted, it was definitely a team effort. And so I wouldn't say he was necessarily underrated for his ability, but I don't think he's overrated either, based on what he's been able to show even in his latter years as a footballer. So I think fairly rated, won everything that he could, and set records at this Real Madrid side. Honestly, we'll look back and make arguments about could him and Modric and Casemiro be in that discussion with Xavi, Iniesta, and Busquets. The fact that we can make an argument now really just shows that, yeah, he was just that good. Moving forward, you probably have him as one of the players that in those midfield threes, you pick three midfielders out of like a budget of $6, and you get $2 for this player. He's, I think, one of those that are going to go overlooked, but fairly deserves to be in that bracket. So those are my final thoughts on Toni Kroos.
Fair enough.
Gio, you as well?
I would argue that he is underrated. I think up until now, obviously, I think with any sport, any player, we tend to go back and reminisce because they say they're retiring and they're leaving the sport. Up until then, some people would. Maybe they have a Real Madrid bias. Maybe they don't. Maybe they have a Germany bias. Maybe they don't. But I don't think he's in many people's like all-time, starting 11s. Has he proven that he can be in the right system? Yeah, I think he deserves to be, absolutely. The credentials kind of speak for itself. So, I think, had he had been a little bit of a flashier guy, a little bit more to the media, I think he would be in a lot more people's, starting 11s, all-time starting 11s. But as of right now, I don't think he's in many people's starting 11. I think he is definitely in that discussion. He very well should be in those discussions. But because of that, I would argue that he is actually slightly underrated. Given what he's earned, I think he should be in more of those conversations.
That's fair.
I think actually I settle nicely right in between the both of you. I think if you had polled people today, I think he's properly rated in terms of his career. But I think eventually he's going to become underrated because when you look at kind of just the bare statistics, I think the comparisons between, let's say, are people going to argue that, Bastian Schweinsteiger was a better midfielder than Toni Kroos? I think that conversation is a little ridiculous. I think it's clearly that case, and I think some people might even, I know my disrespect to these individual type of players are well known in some cases, but like a Frank Lampard or a Xavi Alonso, I don't think they touch what Toni Kroos is able to do on the pitch. Even a player, I would argue, like even we mentioned a couple times in the podcast, Pirlo, I don't see too much difference between those type of players, except for different situations on different teams of what they're able to do on the pitch. Maybe one had a little bit better flowing lock of hair, so it's more fun to look at. But for me, I think that's what's eventually going to be the takeaway, where he's going to get further pushed down this conversation because he doesn't have those high flashy moments. He isn't as much of a player you're going to, I want to use the top 5 goals of Toni Kroos's career, so it's not going to be as interesting. So I think he eventually become a very underrated player. But I hope what we've done with this podcast is shown justice to what he did as a footballer, the impact that he had, how great of a player he was, and really I don't think anyone will ever walk away and say, I didn't like him or I didn't think that he was quality. And I think the consistency of, as Ray I think kind of pointed out at the beginning of our podcast, and I think is the best encapsulation is he's an 8 or 9 out of 10 consistently, and that's all you really want from that type of player and a midfielder in that role.
Yeah, exactly. So, guys, there you have it. We kind of hopefully did justice to Toni Kroos's career, illustrious career, of course, with all of his accolades that we read out today. So, this concludes our podcast for today. If you guys like what you heard, please like and subscribe to us on our social medias. That's at @houseof_footy. If you have any comments, suggestions, or general banter, get in touch with us via email as well, houseoffooty@hotmail.com. Next time you hear from us will be later next week when we look back at the transfer activity that's been happening in this offseason, very, very short offseason, because, of course, the Premier League returns in 2 weeks' time. So until then, guys, thank you, Mac, for joining us.
Peace out.
Thank you, Gio.
Hala Madrid.
See you guys soon.